Hello, everybody. As we probably know, today is December 7th. Now, it is not exactly the specific year that date, of course, has a date of infamy, but as you probably know, if you live here in the United States, December 7th is a very important date in American history, and that's the fact that it was the starting date, essentially, of the United States' involvement in World War II, due to, on December 7th of 1941, the Japanese Empire attacked the U.S. naval base of Pearl Harbor in Oahu, on the island of Oahu in Hawaii, which was a territory at the time. It was not a state. So today is the 79th anniversary of this act of treachery, as was termed by President Roosevelt. President Roosevelt termed it, duh. But anyway, today is the 79th anniversary of that attack, and as for today, I simply want to kind of go over and look over not so much the attack itself, as I deem that most people probably know about the attack. They probably know what happened. We will delve in it a little bit. But the main priority of this video is mostly going to be explaining how Pearl Harbor even came to happen. Because as you may recall, the Japanese and the United States were not always enemies. They were, for a brief time, they were friends. Like, no shorter than probably 25 years before this war. So it's kind of, what we want to cover here is, how did the United States and Japan get onto the path that eventually led to this attack, that in turn led to this armed conflict between the two powers, which of course was part of the wider global conflict already going on, because you already had World War II that had started about 2 years earlier when Germany invaded Poland. But this was the first time the United States was actually attacked, and it kind of focused the United States' pressure that it was mainly focused with Japan more than it was with Germany and Italy for that, at least the beginning of the war a little bit. But what we want to look at is, how did the United States and Japan come to this point? How did their relations break down so much that it came to war? And what exactly caused Japan to order the Pearl Harbor attack that devastated the American Pacific Naval Fleet? So what we're going to start with here is, we're simply going to go back all the way to 1853 to really see any origin of where this comes about. And that's where you're going to first kind of see the United States and Japan interacting, in a way, in foreign relations. Until 1853, Japan had been a very isolationist nation. It was very much secluded. It didn't like foreigners. It kicked them out if they landed there. It was very isolated by the ruling shogunate, the shoguns, who in turn were served by the samurai, and the emperor was there, but the Japanese emperor was largely kind of a puppet. The shoguns held the power. And until 1853, Japan had been this way for roughly 200 to 300 years. It had kind of kicked out any outside Western influence, would not accept any trade with other nations around it. It was very much secluded, and it could accomplish this. So it was an island nation in the early 19th century. That's not that hard to do. Well, in 1853, this changes, because in that year, the Americans send a naval squadron to Japan that lands in Tokyo Bay. And this naval squadron is under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry, who is, ironically, the younger brother of famous United States naval hero Oliver Hazard Perry, who won the Battle of Lake Erie in 1812 against the British. But we discussed that video early on. But anyway, Matthew Perry was his younger brother, and he sails this American naval squadron into Tokyo Bay with one goal. He is under strict orders from the U.S. government and President Millard Fillmore to open Japan up to economic trade by any means necessary if needed, which mostly why he brought the naval squadron. They acted like they were peaceful, but on the background it's kind of showing, but just in case you don't want to open up with us, we'll make you open up with us, because look at our ships. And the bad part was, because Japan had been so isolated, Japan had not industrialized. Its army was not fighting with even guns. It was fighting with swords. And here come these U.S. soldiers that have guns and big old cannons on their boats. And the Japanese kind of realized real quick, even if we don't want to sign a trade with us, they're going to blow us away. because we have nothing to counter that. So Japan reluctantly agreed to reopen its borders to international trade in 1853 to the United States, and this began the first kind of foreign relationship between the United States and Japan. The United States was the nation that opened Japan back up. Now, this soon turned to be a good thing for Japan, because within 20 years, not even 20 years, I'd say, let's see here, I'm calculating, 15 years, between 1868 and 1912, Japan underwent what they call the Meiji Restoration. The Meiji Restoration was basically the period where the shogunate lost its power. They lost any power they had. The samurai were kind of disbanded. The emperor, who had kind of been sidelined for about 200 to 300 years, he gains almost full, complete authority as like a deity. The Japanese people are taught to, at least, they're not so much taught that now. They're definitely not taught that now. But back then, they were taught the emperor was like the son of the sun god. He was divine. He was basically a living god. And you were expected to have the utmost obedience and loyalty to the emperor if you were a Japanese citizen. So the emperor regains his power, and the shogunate is removed, but at the same time, Japan industrializes. They modernize their economy, they modernize their industry, and they modernize even their military. Their military is expanded and modernized with, instead of swords, now we have rifles, now we have guns, now we're getting cannons, now we're getting shotguns, ammunition. Japan starts modernizing rapidly during the Meiji Restoration between 1868 and 1912, which is only about a period of 40 to 50 years. And in terms of industrialization, that's actually pretty quick for a nation. Japan sought to do this for one primary reason, and this was to compete with the Western powers in becoming a major world power. Japan had been this isolated country. The Western powers had a head start. They were already industrialized. They were starting to claim colonies around the world. Japan was just now getting to the ballgame. And Japan, being viewed that it was a major Asian power, it deserved a chunk of the world, and it decided that we're going to try to compete with the West. So that's why they were building up their military. They're building up their economy to try to compete with Western powers. And Japan largely does this very quickly during the Meiji Restoration, especially following two wars that occurred. And first, they had the first Sino-Japanese War against China in 1894 to 1895, in which Japan won the island of Formosa, which is today called Taiwan. They won that from China. They kind of took a little bit of territory from China, a little bit, but it kind of strengthened the Japanese resolve. It was the first major victory of the Japanese army on foreign soil in a long, long time. In fact, if ever. And then about 10 years later, you had the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, in which Japan became the first non-European, non-Western power to win in a war against a Western power. Russia. Russia's Baltic fleet was annihilated during this war by the Japanese, who showed that they had not only created a very strong army, they had created a very superior navy. And honestly, why wouldn't they? I mean, the Japanese are an island-faring they are an island people. I would think they know the ocean better than most. So, of course, their navy is like top-notch, and it beats the Russians, right? Literally blows the ships right out of the water. And this was the first time that a European power, or even a Western power, had ever been defeated by one that was not of Western origin. It was an Eastern Asian power. This was thought to be impossible because for decades, the Western imperial powers had kind of coerced China, and China didn't really have nothing. And they figured, well, no Asian power is going to stand up to us. Well, now Japan's showing it could definitely tangle with you. And through the course of these two wars, Japan is expanding its influence, it's expanding its strength, it's expanding its kind of political influence, and it's expanding its empire it's building at the same time. It gained territory in both wars, and then shortly after the Russo-Japanese War in 1910, Japan annexed the Korean Peninsula as a colony. Korea was a Japanese colony. Now, keep in mind, this was prior to the division of Korea into North and South. This was when Korea was a unified kingdom. Yeah. It was a unified kingdom, I know. It's hard to believe. But the Japanese took that as a colony. Now, of course, they had some atrocities they did, such as using the women as sex slaves, basically, for the Japanese army, as they termed comfort women, which Japan has been highly reluctant to really apologize for out in the open. So, that's one topic, but that's not what we're especially getting on today, but I thought we needed to mention that. And as a side note here, there's a lot of stuff Japan did during World War II that they have yet to apologize for. And I think it's pretty downright wrong. They need to. So then we come up to 1914, when the outbreak of the World War I. World War I breaks out in 1914. The Austro-Hungarian heir to the throne is assassinated by a Serbian nationalist. Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Russia declares war on Austria-Hungary. Germany declares war on Russia. France declares war on Germany. It just goes off and on. Well, even Japan got involved in World War I almost from the get-go, because they had a high kind of military alliance with the British. And the British successfully convinced the Japanese, not that they probably wouldn't have anyway, to join in on the Allied side. Yes, Japan was on the good side during the First World War. They were not an Axis power, they were on the Allied. Keep in mind, there was no Axis powers in World War I, it was the Central powers. But during World War I, Japan was actually our ally. And they took over many of the German colonies and territories and possessions that Germany had, the Imperial German Empire had in China and the Pacific, such as, I think, the Chinese city of Tsingtao was one. Let me think, some others. The Marshall Islands, I know, was a German colony. The Japanese kind of took that one over. Micronesia, Palau, they took over them. Those were German colonies that the Japanese took over from Germany in World War I. And this strengthened Japan's empire as well, as expanding its borders. Now, up to this point, Japan has been building an empire. They've been steadily increasing their strength. They've been steadily kind of increasing their influence. And until this point, there's not really been any major conflict with the other major Western powers other than Russia. Other than Russia, there's not really been any major conflict, even though Russia's not really a Western power. It's not really termed as one. So when I say Western powers, I'm mostly dictating there's been no conflict between Japan and Great Britain. There's been no conflict between it and France, and there's been no conflict up to that point between it and the United States. In 1919, this starts to change, right after the end of the First World War in 1918. In 1919, at the Versailles Peace Conference that discusses and kind of formulates the Versailles Treaty that ends the First World War, Japan is an allied power, and it's on the victorious side. So, of course, it has a delegation that goes there to try to help negotiate the treaty and maybe get a couple of spoils of war in for Japan, such as maybe it can keep the colonies of Germany that it has conquered. Well, as they open up the peace conference, Japan makes a move to try to ask, knowing that it's an Asian power compared to the rest, and thus that it is also a different race than the other powers, it dictates that it would like before they really begin, they kind of discuss the formalities of the negotiations. And Japan puts in a simple request that I really don't think was that bad, that they wanted the talks to have a venue of racial equality, that no one was going to be sidelined due to their race or ethnicity. Which basically said that even though we're an Asian power, we're going to get full participation and full spoiled rewards if we get any out of this conference, regardless if we're not European or not. Well, almost immediately, the European powers at the peace conference, including even the United States, kind of just rejected that thing and just threw it off the table. Japan's insulted by this. Keep in mind, the Japanese are they are a nation and people of honor. Honor very much was endemic to them, and I think it's still very endemic to them today. And for Japan's just basically be pushed aside and ignored at the peace conference, as they eventually kind of were, this, to the Japanese, this was a slap in the face. This was, well, what the heck? We just helped you win a war, we just helped you when you asked us to, and now you're basically going to push us aside and say, oh yeah, it was nice seeing you, bye, go off the table now, we don't need you. Japan saw this as dishonor to it. It saw this as kind of an insult. and it kind of walked out of the conference. Japan did sign the treaty, but during the rest of the peace conference, Japan's delegation actually walked out and left. And this was really the first period of tension between the West and Japan, because Japan got the ideology that before this they thought that we could gain, if we can gain the respect of the Western powers, of the Western imperial powers, we can build our empire and be recognized as a major world power in the position that we want. Up until this point, they believed that they could do that through diplomacy, through alliances. And up to that point, they were more than willing to do that. After the Versailles Peace Conference, Japan kind of walks away. It's angered, it's bitter, and it kind of comes away with the ideology that if we're going to get any respect, it's going to be by fighting our way to respect. We're going to have to fight to get that respect that we want. It ain't going to be gained through diplomatic negotiations, because these people are racist. Which, to be truthful, they were. In this point, I feel bad for Japan. But I don't feel bad for Japan what they did later. So, this is when relations start to deteriorate. And this further starts deteriorating immediately after, when Japan is later forced to hand over most of the German territories that it did acquire during the war over to China. And some of them it's forced to hand over to other powers. There's only a small handful that Japan is actually allowed to keep under its control. And of course, like Italy did at the same time, which had been also on the Allied side during World War I, it felt it had been cheated. It had not been given the territory it had been promised. And in 1922, Japan is further angered when the Japanese government signs the Washington Naval Treaty in 1922, which basically limited the size of most of the major world powers' navies, including Britain, the United States, and France, and of course Japan. Now, Japan saw this more negatively than the other powers, and this was because, unlike the other powers that already had very extensively large navies and were well established, Japan was just starting to get a big, large navy that could actually defend itself, and then this comes through that limits the size of that navy. The Japanese kind of look at it and they're like, okay, isn't it awfully funny that just now we get a navy that's actually worthy of competing with the Western powers, and now they put, just as we're starting to get that, they slap these restrictions just to keep us weak? And of course, although this has been signed by the Japanese government, there were many in the Japanese population, including the military. The Japanese military was very big at this time. It was growing influence at that time. And many of the military leaders saw this as an insult to Japanese honor and tradition. Japan was angered by these events. And the military leaders, as they grew angry, they gained support with the population. And as the 1920s bore on, Japan's government becomes increasingly kind of controlled, not by the actual politicians, but by the military leaders, but by the generals and admirals of the army and navy. Japan becomes more controlled. Basically, it's becoming run by the military. It's becoming a militaristic run society, like Germany, like Nazi Germany was quickly becoming about a decade later. Things then take the biggest turn for the worse in 1929. The Great Depression hits. The stock market crash of 1929 sends not only the United States into economic recession of the worst type, but it sends the entire world, into economic recession. So this hurts Japan. And this hurts Japan more than other nations because of one key reason. Here, it's largely due to how Japan's economy works, and Japan's economy is very simple. Japan does not have hardly any natural resources for its own. It's an island nation. It really doesn't have any natural resources. Japan's economy is heavily dependent on imports of supplies and resources from other countries. Well, the Great Depression comes. Those imports either slow down immensely or they completely stop altogether. Japan's no longer getting the food it needs. It's no longer getting the supplies it needs, the resources. Its economy is starting to crumble due to the lack of imports that other nations are being able to send. Japan's military leaders, by this point in time, they've got basically full control of the government at this point in time in the early 1930s. And they come up with the solution that the way to solve Japan's economic problems is not so much through economic policy, but through expanding the Japanese empire. That if we expand our territory, we can gain and acquire territories that are rich in resources that we do not have, that usually we would have to pay other nations to import those in. And if we can acquire those territories, we can just get the resources for ourselves. We don't got to worry about someone else supplying it to us. And of course, this didn't seem like all that bad of an idea, especially given Japan's economic problems at the time. So the Japanese military leaders kind of make the decision that we're going to go ahead and start expanding the empire. So in 1931, as part of this, they invade the Chinese province of Manchuria, which is north of Korea. In 1931, this Manchuria is conquered by the Japanese. It is turned into their little puppet state of Manchukuo. And this territory is largely rich in the natural resources, especially like iron, soybeans for food, and other natural resources. And there's even a bigger asset. There's empty, unsettled land. The Japanese are kind of restricted on their home islands. They're islands. They can't expand the islands that much. So their population's growing and the islands aren't getting any bigger. So they're running out of room, so this provides room for people to go live. Well, this was not well received at all by the international community. And this actually becomes a major problem to the international community, as the League of Nations, the predecessor to the United Nations, kind of denounces Japan for doing this, but they kind of sit there and do nothing. And Japan, seeing this as an insult to their honor, after the League of Nations condemns them for occupying Manchuria, goes ahead and decides, okay, then we're withdrawing. We're getting out of here. We're not going to be part of you anymore. A couple years later down the road, it gets worse. Japan's leaders kind of come to the realization that we want to control China's import market. We want to control all of China's resources because China is an inferior power. Because by this point in time, the military leaders are in charge, and the military leaders were very nationalistic. Now, what does nationalistic mean? Nationalistic is basically you're full of nationalism, and nationalism is the idea that your country is better and superior to any on the planet. But it has side effects. Nationalism seems good, and it can be good, but there's points where it kind of goes over the top. Now, if you want to see a modern sense of nationalism, I'm going to use a very current one. Let's look at none other than Donald J. Trump. Donald Trump is very much a nationalist. He is very pro-American. He's very indoctrinated in patriotic ways, as he claims, and he's very pro-American when he's speaking. He's very much nationalistic. He believes that the United States is better than most other countries. But there is a downside to nationalism, and as I may bring to your attention, it was nationalism that basically led to the First World War, because each of the combatant nations thought that they were better than the other, and it spurred competition between them, and that eventually breaks out into armed conflict. Because Germany wanted to build a navy that was as good as Britain's. France was worried about getting a bigger army than Germany was. Russia was worried about still extending its influence into Europe. It was all kinds of nationalistic problems. And this also poses a problem for Japan, because this nationalism causes it to forego certain human rights when it goes ahead and invades China fully in open war in 1937, trying to take basically the entire country. And Japan did many things during this invasion. They had the rape of Nanking, for instance, where they raped almost every woman when they took the Chinese city of Nanking. They raped almost every woman they found, and the men, they went ahead and literally used as live bayonet practice. They were cutting the heads off children and babies. How wonderful. I mean, just how wonderful that they don't apologize for any of this crap. Really. But yet, we have full economic ties with them. I hate to tell them this, but if I was ever in a position of power that I could maybe kind of negotiate with the Japanese a little bit, let's say I was president, I'm very certain that I would probably threaten to cut off certain diplomatic ties with Japan until they could agree to start apologizing for some of the stuff that they did during World War II, because they largely, in Japanese society, they're not taught the full history. If they were not born or lived during that time period, they aren't really taught it because the Japanese people try to hide it. They don't want the people to know about it. And there's Japanese government officials that don't think Japan has to apologize. Well, Germany's had no problem apologizing for what it did. And then in some ways, I honestly think that in some ways, some of the stuff the Japanese did was just as bad or worse than the Germans. Minus the Holocaust. The Holocaust was definitely far worse. But anyway, this nationalistic fervor kind of drives Japan into not only wanting one region of China, but they believe that they're superior than the Chinese, and they deserve the entire country and all the land and resources that China has and the market that it obtains. So this really starts setting the United States into play here. And the United States is set into play because for a very long time, the United States has been a Chinese ally. And although it's very isolationist at this point, because ever since the end of the First World War, the majority of the American people are isolationists. They don't believe that it's the United States' business to get involved in any foreign wars anymore. They don't want that. They've seen the First World War. That was enough. They didn't want to get involved anymore, and they had this isolationist view that don't matter what happens, we're not going to get involved. Well, this sets the United States in a bind because the government realizes that Japan's being overly aggressive and something needs to be done. But at the same time, they can't really move against the people that elected them into office when their public wish is to stay neutral and just kind of stay out of it. So this puts them in a bind. Now, this causes the Japanese to kind of continue that aggression uninterrupted. All the United States does is basically provide some monetary loans to China to try to prop up its economy and get it some monetary aid, and they continue to denounce Japan's actions, but really don't send no military hardware, don't threaten to have a military action done or nothing. And it was further amplified later in 1937 when they took the Chinese city of Nanjing and they accidentally attacked and sunk the American gunboat USS Panay, which was in the city at that time. And they killed 3 American crew members on this boat, as well as wounding quite a few others. Now, this combined with the fact that as the Japanese are invading China, there's news images coming out about babies showing like they're burned, they're crying without their mothers, the bombing, some of the atrocities the Japanese are committing, and the news photos, the news articles are coming out of China, and that they're reading this, and the American people slowly start to kind of have a more aggressive view toward Japan at that time. They're not liking the Japanese aggression that they're seeing happen across the Pacific Ocean. Now, the U.S. attempted to stop Japan not by going to war, but by banning and placing economic sanctions, basically banning exports of certain materials that could help Japan in a war. And they banned the United States began to ban exports of aircraft to Japan, scrap metal, rubber, and other war materials that Japan might use to kind of build its war machine, might use to kind of foster its war machine and continue it. Stuff that might force Japan to kind of put a halt. Well, this did not only not have the desired effect. Japan still went ahead and pressed into China, but at the same time, it emboldened Japan because they started to realize that as the United States started doing this, the United States did have some impact on their economic problem, and it did have some impact on their supply. And Japan further realized that China may not be enough. We need to get even more resources to be fully self-sustaining, that we don't got to worry about a country cutting aid off to us, because by the time we get the territory, we can get it ourselves. We don't need them to send it to us. So this further emboldens them a little bit, actually. And in October of 1940, Japan invades French Indochina, which comprises modern-day Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, in Southeast Asia in search of these war materials like rubber. And at the same time, they decide that they're going to ally themselves with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy in 1940 in what becomes known as the Tripartite Pact, or also later known as the Axis powers. Why did Japan ally itself with these powers? Well, because they shared 2 things in common: All these countries were kind of run by the military. They were autocratic, militaristic countries. They were run by their militaries, by dictatorships, basically. And they were also very prominent about expanding their territories and had a very high sense of nationalistic fervor. They were very nationalistic, like Japan was. So Japan allies itself with Nazi Germany in fascist Italy in late 1940, as well as invading French Indochina in search of further resources. Now, as soon as this happens with the invasion of French Indochina, the United States is appalled, and they start demanding that Japan withdraw, not only from China, but from there as well. But they have no force to back it up, and Japan ignores it. Up to this point, the Japanese have seen war with the United States as a possibility, but they really didn't see it as it was going to actually happen. And neither did the United States. The final straw comes in July of 1941, when President Franklin Roosevelt, after Congress passed a bill, signed into law a bill that basically placed an embargo of the sale of all oil to Japan from the United States. This would only be lifted if Japan agreed to withdraw from French Indochina and from China itself. Japan was furious. Now, why was Japan furious? Because economically, it would kill Japan's war effort. Because 90%, I repeat, 90% of Japan's oil was foreign supply. And out of all that oil, guess how much of that came from the United States? Almost all of it. By the United States placing this oil embargo, basically Japan's being cut off. 90% of its oil is being cut off. This could put its army on a standstill, its navy on a standstill, and its economy in shambles. They can't function without that oil. This ticks Japan off to no end. Japan sees it as the United States is trying to meddle in our affairs. They're trying to stop us from becoming a world power. They're standing in our way. We've got to do something about it. And we got to take more territories because now they're taking away our oil. So they set their sights on Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, which is a U.S. territory. And Japan at the same time is debating, are we going to have to go to war with the United States? Well, to the military leaders, it's no question. They very much want to go to war. They're angry with the United States. They deem that the United States will stand in the way of a Japanese empire in the Pacific as long as it's there. So the military leaders, who, keep in mind, since they're really the ones in power at this point, they're the ones really calling the shots, and this is where Pearl Harbor, the decision to attack Pearl Harbor comes about. Now, where exactly is Pearl Harbor? And that's what you really got to look at here. Pearl Harbor is located roughly 2,000 miles from the United States. It's on the island of Oahu in what is now the U.S. state of Hawaii. It is about 2,000 miles from the U.S. mainland, and it's about 4,000 miles from the Japanese islands. It's approximately not quite midway between the United States and Japan. Now, as the probability of the United States and Japan going to war increased in 1940 and 1941, no one really thought about, well, they were thinking about it. They were trying to, the U.S. generals in particular, the U.S. military was trying to predict, if it comes to war, where are the Japanese likely to attack us first? And no one, and I repeat, very few, if any, predicted that it would be Pearl Harbor. Why? Because it's 4,000 miles from Japan. It doesn't make to them, it didn't make no sense. And thus, they start placing the U.S. Pacific Naval Fleet there, and the air squadrons and everything else, in like open array and out in the open, because they deem that it's too far away from Japan that Japan would never even bother trying to attack that. The ideal target they thought the Japanese would attack would be the Philippine Islands, which was a U.S. territory at the time, and like right there next to China. If Japan can knock that out, they knock out a American hub of manpower in the Asian theater. But no one really anticipated that the Japanese would attack Hawaii. Because of this, Pearl Harbor was relatively undefended as well, and it was due to this very factor that it became a very easy and highly profitable target if done correctly by the Japanese. The Japanese kind of realized this, and they're like, the heck with the Philippines, let's hit that. They don't expect us. You had, and here's how stupid you got it. You got aircraft in dozens of airfields in Pearl Harbor, packed closely together as anti-sabotage efforts, but there's hundreds of them just out in the open in rows. And here's the dumb one. You got your entire Pacific Naval Fleet at Pearl Harbor, including aircraft carriers, battleships, destroyers, cruisers, and submarines. And guess what? All the battleships are literally moored in a big old long row. Like, there's a single file line. Very easy bombing target, especially when they're docked. Right next to what they had, to the island in the middle of Pearl Harbor, which is known as Ford's Island. And this was known as Battleship Row. Now, Pearl Harbor, as we mentioned, this presents a very perfect opportunity of target for the Japanese to strike at. And Admiral Yamamoto was the Japanese admiral who kind of came up with the entire Pearl Harbor plan. He was the main architect of the attack. He was the commander of the combined Japanese naval fleet. He was like their big main admiral they had in the Navy. And Yamamoto understood the Americans because, in fact, he had lived in the United States for a while during his youth. He understood the Americans better than most Japanese generals did. And he was also one of the few Japanese military leaders that kind of indicated that maybe it might not be such a good thing to go to war with the United States, because Yamamoto made it very clear that he kind of dreaded getting the United States into the war because he feared that he had seen what the United States could do in terms of economic and industrial capacity when it really was stirred into motion. And he deemed that if we go to war with the United States, you're going to be awakening, as he termed it, you're going to awaken a sleeping giant, and it may be our undoing. Now, of course, the other leaders thought that Japan was too big. They had too much of a nationalistic fervor. They didn't believe that Japan could ever be bested by the United States. But Yamamoto was one of the few that, although he was the architect of the Pearl Harbor plan, he had his reservations about implementing it because he feared what would happen. He knew. Now, right here, I think we have... is a picture of Admiral Yamamoto when he was this about a year before Pearl Harbor, but this was him. He was later shot down during the World War II, I think about 2 years after Pearl Harbor in 1943. American intelligence kind of intercepted his flight plans over the radio, and they managed to shoot down his plane. So he was shot down over the Pacific. But anyway, that is him. Now, we go on here, and because of this, Japan has the attack on Pearl Harbor comes to have one significance. What exactly was the whole purpose? And that's what we really are wanting to look at here today. We've covered the history of how this came up to this moment, but what exactly was the purpose of the Japanese at striking Pearl Harbor? And the purpose was very simple. And it's very simple if you really look at it. Japan, at this point, wants to expand its empire, wants to take Southeast Asia, but it knows the United States is the only power in the Pacific because Britain and France are occupied with fighting Germany. I mean, France has already surrendered to Germany. The United States is really the only power in the Pacific that could pose a threat to Japan. Its naval fleet, in particular. The United States has a very large Pacific naval fleet in the Pacific Ocean that could pose a threat to Japan's navy, which is the main, at that point, with its main armed force, because, of course, it's in the Pacific. There's dozens of islands, and you need a navy. Well, Japan realizes this, and the whole goal of the Pearl Harbor attack was not to destroy the U.S. Naval Pacific Fleet, but to cripple it, to knock it out for a period of time. Approximately, as Yamamoto guessed, that the attack would knock out the U.S. Pacific Naval Fleet for a period of about 6 months. And during that time, Japan could rush through Asia, conquer the territories and resources it needed, that by the time the United States finally got the Pacific Fleet up and running again to the point that they could go to war, it would be too late because Japan would have established a very good defensible position that the United States wouldn't be able to penetrate. Basically, you knock out the Pacific Fleet in order to gain us time to build up this defense position that will be impenetrable to the United States. It wasn't to destroy the Pacific Naval Fleet, but it was to cripple it, to hinder the United States' ability to wage war. Now, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo of Japan was the main kind of instigator of wanting to attack Pearl Harbor, and on November 5th, he officially gave the order for the assault to occur. And on November 7th, the task force was assembled near the Kuril Islands off Japan's northernmost island of Hokkaido. The Japanese fleet was led by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, and it consisted of 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Keep in mind, each of these aircraft carriers has hundreds of aircraft in its hangar. At the time that the fleet is being, at the same time as the attack has been ordered to occur, and the Japanese naval fleet is assembling, the United States and Japan are still in ongoing peace negotiations, trying to bring a peaceful solution to the tension between the two countries. Japan gives no indication that it's not only considering war, but it already has an attack plan and is literally arming ships at this moment to go across the Pacific and attack you as we speak. Japan gives no indication of this. They express that they want a peaceful solution, not failed. Oh, did I fail to mention we got an aircraft carrier fleet sailing for Hawaii right now? The fleet, as it sails off, it sets sail on November 26 off Japan's northernmost Kuril Islands off Hokkaido, and it is ordered to maintain strict radio silence as it sails across the North Pacific Ocean. That way it would not be detected by any American radio transmissions or radar or anything. And officially it goes and continues until it reaches a location about 275 miles northwest of Hawaii. Right here we have a small map kind of showing you how the Japanese, what the route that they kind of took on different dates. As you can see, they set off from, as we can term here, they set off from the Kuril Islands up here in northern Japan. Up here on November 26th, they kind of continue out with radio silence in about fairly straight line. And then they kind of turning south on the December 4th, kind of coming up to about right here. Where's Hawaii? I'm trying to see. Right here's Hawaii with Pearl Harbor. They stop about 275 miles northwest of Oahu, which you can't exactly pinpoint on this map. And then, of course, after the attack, they kind of turn around and sail back home, but go to the southern port. So we get to, finally, here of the attack going to occur. And now it attacked in Asia, it was December 8th, because keep in mind, in Asia and Japan, it's one day ahead of what it is here. So morning of December 7th in Hawaii was actually morning of December 8th in Japan. But to us, we recognize it as occurring on Sunday, December 7th. At 5:30 a.m. on December 7th, Hawaii time, the Japanese launched the very first wave of aircraft off their carriers, which consisted of 183 planes, Japanese Mitsubishi Zero fighters, which were some of the best aircraft of the entire war. These planes were detected on radar by U.S. radar monitors, but they made a critical error. They were told that it was probably just a B-29 bomber group coming in from the mainland, and thus they dismissed it. They didn't think nothing of it. Let alone you see not 1, not 10, not 50, you're seeing over 100, almost 200 planes coming in. You really think that's B-29 bombers? And not to mention that earlier that very morning, the Japanese also had 5 midget subs they tried to send into Pearl Harbor to try to kind of lie in wait until the planes got there and then start torpedoing in the harbor itself. Well, none of these midget subs made it. There was only 5. And one of them was actually sunk that very morning by a U.S. destroyer just outside the Pearl Harbor gate, just outside the mouth of the harbor. And at the time of the attack finally occurring, there was still confirmation kind of in the air of whether or not it had been a Japanese sub. If they had known about it sooner, they probably, and then kind of pieced together the planes on the radar, it's very likely that at least Pearl Harbor wouldn't have been able to stop the attack, but they definitely would have been much better, at least alerted to it. Pearl Harbor on that very morning had the following ships on Battleship Row. You had the USS California, the USS Maryland, USS Oklahoma, USS Tennessee, USS West Virginia, USS Nevada, and USS Arizona, which I think we all know. And in fact, you don't know, this is the Arizona. At least what it once looked like. This is what it once looked like. It does not look like this now. I mean, after that day, no, it did not look like this. And then you also had the repair ship Vestal, which was moored next to the Arizona. And then in the dry docks, you had the flagship of the Pacific Fleet and Arizona's sister ship, the USS Pennsylvania. And on the other side of Ford's Island, you had some other smaller ships, including the old battleship turned training ship USS Utah, which was mostly just used for training new sailors. It was not really used in active duty anymore. But the ships in Battleship Row were active duty battleships. These ships were crucial. They were the backbone of the U.S. Naval Pacific Fleet. At 7:48 a.m., the planes arrived over Oahu, and they began bombing Battleship Row and launching airborne torpedoes that were fired and launched into the water and then went into the ships. They had special fins, special wooden fins on them to keep them from... Since the harbor was real shallow, the big fear was, well, how are we going to launch a torpedo? Because torpedoes usually go down a ways if you drop them from the air, and they might hit the harbor mud and just explode there. Well, they put these wooden fins on the back of them to try to keep the torpedo kind of elevated and keep it from hitting that bottom before it would start going forward. And it worked. At 8:10 a.m., an 1,800-pound bomb smashed through the frickin' deck of the Arizona and exploded her forward powder magazine and sunk the ship, killing 1,100 men, 1,100 men. This is half the casualties that day were on this ship alone. Half the casualties were on this ship alone. You want to know where the bomb hit? I can show you. The bomb was dropped from a plane, comes straight down, nose end first, and literally hits... I'm going to try to turn this in a way you can see it. Pretend you're a Japanese bomber, and you're looking... This is what you'd see. You'd be looking at the Arizona from overhead. This bomb literally comes and hits about right... Well, I'm trying to think here. Right here. It smashes through the deck, goes down into the ship, into about right here, and there's a powder magazine in there. Ammunition stores. When that bomb detonates, the bomb's not the only thing that detonates. All those ammunition shells explode. It literally blows this out. This part of the deck collapses inward. And Arizona is almost basically, her bottom is actually cracked. Basically, she's almost ripped in half. Not in half, but the front end is almost ripped off by the force of this explosion. Because the bomb went in about right here. Right between the number 1 and number 2 turrets. Now, most of the sailors were caught under surprise. Some of them were still in their beds. It was a Sunday. There were church services going on decks. And the sailors, largely, they were either still sleeping or they were attending church service. As it was Sunday, it was kind of the rest day at the Navy. And thus, when these attacks began, many of them, as they got out of bed, woke up and they were dead because they didn't have time to really react. Most of them were still asleep in their bunks or whatever below decks. The USS Oklahoma was hit by 5 torpedoes. And then, instead of exploding, it capsized and rolled upside down in the harbor. And it traps many sailors within her hull because they can't get out. Now, luckily, they later on did get most of the men out of there. There were some they weren't able to, but most of the men they did get out by taking torch cutters and cutting through the hull. But it killed a lot of men. The USS Nevada was the only ship to really actually get underway. She was behind the Arizona, and thus she had kind of some more room to kind of move because Nevada didn't have a ship behind her, not like the rest of them did. And Nevada, after she had been hit by 1 bomb, and she tried to get underway to try to get out of the harbor and escape. Well, the Japanese plane saw this, and they start trying to target her because they're like, oh, if we can sink that thing right at the mouth of the harbor, that will bottle up the entire fleet here. Well, luckily, the Nevada's captain kind of realized what the Japanese were going to do. He kind of realized that I'm taking a big risk by doing this, so instead of letting the Japanese sink the Nevada, he goes ahead and purposely beaches her on the beach. That way, she might get hit by a bomb, but she ain't going to be sunk. Now, after hitting the battleships, the Japanese then moved and attacked the planes on Ford Island, right next to the battleships on Ford Island that were on Wheeler Field. And this is where the aircraft were packed very close together. There was 126 aircraft on that island. You had 42 were destroyed, 41 damaged, and 43 survived. The Japanese made mincemeat out of these planes. Only 6 U.S. planes actually got airborne into the sky during the first wave of the attack. Only 6 planes against 183 Japs. At 8:50 a.m., a second wave struck. And this second wave was less successful than the first because by this point the U.S. has kind of woken up. It's starting to man the anti-aircraft guns that it can. And it's starting to better its defense. Now, Wave 2 did manage to sink 2 destroyers that were in dry dock next to the Pennsylvania, and it did hit the Pennsylvania with a bomb, and it knocked out more of the aircraft and hangars. By 9 a.m., the Japanese were finally gone. They only launched 2 waves. A third wave was possibly kind of debated, but ultimately, Vice Admiral Nagumo kind of dictated that we have not seen the aircraft carriers. They could be coming right up on us right now, and we wouldn't know it. So he decided that instead of stay there and continue it, which he should have done, honestly, he instead decided that 2 waves was enough and he would go. Now here we have some photos that we're going to show here. I have a couple photos. Here, this is actually a photo taken by a Japanese pilot during the attack. Some of them were actually armed with cameras. And this was actually one of them. This was a Japanese photo taken during the attack, but you can kind of see the opening of the attack. You can even see at least 2 planes in this photo flying overhead. This is coming in on Ford Island. This is Pearl Harbor. This is Ford Island. The big Wheeler Field is like right in the center of that island. This is where all the aircraft are. Over here on the other side, this is Battleship Row, with all the battleships moored next to each other. Over here is where you had like the training ship Utah and everything else. As you can see, if you look really closely, and I'm going to put it close, right here's a Japanese plane, and right over here's one. And the big geyser of water that you see right here is actually a torpedo hit on the West Virginia. The torpedo has just hit that battleship, and that's why you see that water plume. You're literally seeing a torpedo hit a battleship right there. And if you really want to look here, this up here, I can identify some of the ships. Let's see. This right here is the California. This up here, this lone little battleship. The one in the very back, that's the Nevada. Right here's the Arizona. That is later going to be the biggest casualty of that day. And then you have the West Virginia. I don't know what happened. Then you have the West Virginia, which is the one the torpedo hit is right in front of. And then the Oklahoma up here. And I think that one of these is the Tennessee. I think that's the Tennessee right inland toward the island. And this is the Maryland. See here. We go through. Here we have the Nevada. Actually, she's been hit by a bomb as she's trying to get underway to get out of the harbor. Of course, she was later beached because the Japanese started targeting her. And here you probably have, right here you have one of the planes that was bombed on Wheeler Field that was just destroyed. And then finally, you have probably one of the most famous images of that day of this battleship. It's approximately, if you're looking at this section right here, you're going to see this turret in the photo, and this is just kind of slumped forward because of how the ship is, and you can see it's already sunk. The water's already up to about probably up to about right here. The ship's kind of already sunk into the harbor. But you can see the flames and everything else. You can just see it's scribbled. This is the Arizona. Right here you can see this is the bridge tower up here. And then right there you have the turret. And it's just settled into the water at that point. You see the flame is just smoking, burning. But that, and then right here we have a photo of, this was taken about a couple days after the attack of Battleship Row, and you can definitely kind of see the whole devastation that was wreaked on the battleships here. The black stuff in that water is oil coming out of the battleships. That's oil. Then you can point out a couple ships. Up here you have California kind of by itself. It was covered in oil, kind of just here. There's a Tennessee. Tennessee kind of got off lightly. Maryland did as well because they were kind of inboard. The West Virginia and Oklahoma got the brunt of it. I mean, West Virginia you can see is partially kind of leaning towards side. Oklahoma is entirely capsized. That's the one you got men trapped in. And then back here with the biggest oil, you got the Arizona just leaking and spilling her guts out. And Nevada would have been about right here, but remember, she got underway and tried to get out. So we go here, and what was the aftermath of the attacks? The Japanese had planned to end negotiations with the United States approximately 30 minutes prior to the attack being launched. However, the message was delivered very late. It was delivered an hour late by the Japanese ambassador, and thus the attack pretty much technically became a surprise attack. It was done without an official declaration of war, which of course angered the United States even further, that the Japanese had not officially declared war yet, and here they go and attack us. On the very next day, President Franklin Roosevelt spoke before Congress, and he called December 7th, as he termed it, as we probably all know, a date which shall live in infamy. And as he very willingly put it in his opening sentence, he said that yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which shall live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. That was as he put it very intelligently. Now, Roosevelt did ask Congress to, at the end of his speech, he asked that Congress declare war on Japan, and this was on December 8th, which, of course, Congress overwhelmingly did. Only one senator from Montana actually voted against it, and that was only because she was a pacifist. But everyone else voted in favor of declaring war. The isolationist group in the United States, basically, it melted away and dissolved overnight. People were electrified to come and enter the war as soon as this occurred. On December 11th, just days after the United States declared war on Japan, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States as part of the Axis alliance, since they were supposed to come to the other's aid if needed. It was also spelled the death knell of them. Casualties. In all, 2,403 Americans were killed in the Pearl Harbor attack, including sailors, soldiers, and civilians. There were over 1,000 who ended up being wounded. The Japanese suffered very little in comparison for their little victory, where they only had about 64 killed, including the men in the submarines and a couple of aircraft. They only lost 29 planes, and only 74 were damaged. The United States by far got the worst out of it. We had the U.S. Pacific Fleet was basically crippled. You had 21 ships were sunk, 300 aircraft were destroyed, and all... Oh my gosh. That's too much. Anyway, all of the battleships in Battleship Row, although they were all mostly sunk or damaged, they were all eventually raised and refloated and put back into service, except for 3. Oklahoma, which had rolled upside down, the Arizona, and across the island, where you had the training battleship Utah. They also went ahead and didn't raise that one either. Those were left in the harbor. Now, Oklahoma was later raised, but when they got done, they had to remove so much of her superstructure they decided they were going to scrap her. So in 1944, they went ahead, they were towing her to San Francisco to be scrapped, and a storm come up, and she broke the moorings, and she sank somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. She's still somewhere down in there. We don't know where. That's actually, if you ever got an interest to go find a shipwreck, go try to find the Oklahoma, because they lost her in tow. We don't know where she's at. So if you go to Pearl Harbor today, you can still go see the Arizona, of course, because the Arizona is the one that's got the big memorial over it, given it had the most casualties on that day, given that half of the casualties were from her alone. But if you go to the other side of the island, and I don't know if it's open to the public or not, I think it's kind of restricted access, but you also have the Utah is over there. And if you look on Google Earth or Google Maps and go zoom in on the island, and you can kind of see, you can see the 2 wrecks. You can see Arizona very prominently, and if you go almost directly on the other side of the island, you can kind of see the Utah kind of poking out of the water too. Also, on the same day that Pearl Harbor happened, on what was December 8th in Asia, Japan struck with their simultaneous attack plan. They also attacked the Philippines. They attacked Hong Kong. They attacked Malaysia. They attacked Guam and Wake Island. They attacked all of these simultaneously because they knew the United States wouldn't be able to stop them at that point in time. And although Japan had indeed won a victory at Pearl Harbor, it had missed 4 crucial aspects during its attack that proved fatal. It had failed to hit the aircraft carriers, the other major component of the United States Pacific Fleet, and this was because the aircraft carriers were not in port at that time. Thank God they were not. They were actually out on a training exercise that morning. So when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the aircraft carriers were not there. They didn't return until later the next day. So they missed the aircraft carriers, which proves a big blunder. The Japanese also failed to properly target and hit the repair facilities, which is a big dum-dum why you didn't do it, because I don't know if you realize this, they got repair facilities, they can probably repair the damage. Then you also have the fuel depots, which stored oil and fuel. They were not hit, hardly, and the ammunition magazines. The Japanese hit a couple of crucial targets during the attack on Pearl Harbor that they should have hit, and it proved fatal. Because Japan, it did get the advantage that Yamamoto had said they would get, but for about 6 months, Japan was unchallenged in the Pacific. Nothing could stand against them. But just like Yamamoto guessed, the end eventually came, and as he had termed it, I fear we have only awakened a sleeping giant and instilled in him a fierce and terrible resolve. Yamamoto was right. Within 6 months, Japan's navy was crushed at the Battle of Midway in June of 1942, where the U.S. Navy, literally with its remaining aircraft carriers, was able to basically crush the Japanese fleet as it tried to invade Midway Atoll northwest of Hawaii. The U.S. beat Japan with 2 aircraft carriers, and Japan brought 4. And you want to know how many aircraft carriers Japan lost in that battle? All of them. And out of the 6 aircraft carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor, 4 of those carriers were sunk at Midway within 6 months. The Akagi, the Soryu, the Hiryu, and the Kaga. The Japanese Yeah, it was a splendid victory for a short term, but did it actually accomplish what the Japanese hoped? No, it did not stop them from losing to the United States in the Second World War. If they had simply not done it, I think they probably would have been better off. So today, as we mentioned, it's been 79 years. Before we go on, I'm going to show this. I think we got two more photos. Two more. Here we have a picture of President Roosevelt giving his address, his Day of Infamy speech to Congress on the very next day, on December 8th, in which he asked Congress to declare war on Japan. Of course, he's right here. And then, I don't know how well you're going to see this, but this is the memorial that is there today of the Arizona. It straddles over the wreck. It does not touch it, but it goes over the wreckage of the Arizona. You might be able to see the Arizona wreck in this photo. I don't know if you really can because of the lighting. I know you can probably definitely see the big brown one. That is the base of one of the turrets. That they took the turrets off. They salvaged a lot of the superstructure, but the round thing you see is actually the base of this turret. Like, take the turret off and this round thing underneath. That's what you're seeing. The memorial approximately goes over about right over here. Or right in here. And then also you can kind of see that even today, the Arizona is still leaking oil. This little kind of blurred thing here, that's actual oil. You know, even almost 80 years after the attack, the Arizona is still leaking oil into the Pearl Harbor. But anyway, today is the 79th anniversary of these attacks. And December 8th as well, whenever this video gets posted. But anyway, I thought it was very important that we touch up on this event, kind of explain exactly, not so much the attack itself, but where it come from, why did this happen, and maybe what did Japan miss? What was their failure in Pearl Harbor? That was what we mainly wanted to touch base on here today. So, hopefully, I hope everyone pays their respects today to Pearl Harbor in some way or form. If you have any opportunity to see a Pearl Harbor veteran, which I really don't think you probably will, because there's not a whole lot of them left, unless you're maybe your family member. There's not a whole lot of them left, and of course COVID. But if you by chance do, even if they're your family, be sure to honor them today, because they went through a lot that day. They really did. So if any of them did happen to see this video, and I highly don't anticipate that there would be, but if there was, I do salute you, and thank you for your service. But that covers Pearl Harbor, the attack on Pearl Harbor on the 79th anniversary of these attacks. Hopefully everyone will do their part to remember these attacks in the future. I think it definitely needs to be remembered for what it was. So anyway, that concludes today's video. So we will see you back here probably later in the week when I cover the election of 1800. If we get to that, I may not do that. I may do that. I don't know. I'm going to still look at that, but you'll know if the video comes up. But anyway, that ends it for today. So, as always, like, subscribe, whatever else. Leave a comment, leave a suggestion. I don't care which. But feel free to do what you need to do to put some input or save the video, whatever. But anyway, that concludes it for today. So, hopefully everyone has a good rest of their week. And we will see you back here with the next video as it comes out, whenever it comes out here, either this week or next week. So have a good day, and may God bless you all, and may God bless America.